Well, I gotta say, it is good to be back with you all. I really hope it was a good holiday season for you. I feel especially fortunate to be back because I was in Minnesota for the holidays. I was gone last week. That's where my wife's family is from. And I experienced cold like I've never experienced it before. And we go up there every year. But on the day we left, it was negative 20 degrees. Why would you live in a place that's negative 20 degrees? And the high of the day, negative 6. As a high, I thought, is this a joke? How can that be the high of negative 6? It was a little sad. My girls were so excited to go up there, play in the snow, experience winter. Literally too cold to go outside. We said, you just can't go. The news was fun. The news was saying you will get frostbite in 30 minutes or less if you are outside. And so it's good to be back in Tampa. Tampa's a little chilly, but it's not frostbite chilly. So I'm happy to be here with you guys and starting off the year right in this community. Now we're starting a new series, so you picked the right Sunday to be here. It's a series that you voted for called Big Decisions, where we're going to look at God's Word and say, how does God's Word give us insight into how to make big decisions of our life? Well, it was a couple weeks ago now that I asked you to write down some of the big decisions that you were wrestling with or that you were working through. So I'd like to show you some of those on the screen. These are things you wrote down of big decisions that you're wondering about. They include this: what should my major be in college? Or what college should I attend? What job should I do? Or should I change jobs? Should I get married? And if so, should I marry this person? Should I have kids? How many? What friends will help me be the type of person I want to be? And how should I spend my time, or what little of it I have? These are a snapshot of the questions that you asked. And so I hope that if you see a decision or question up there that you have also wondered about or wrestled with, that you realize you're not alone. As a community, these were the type of questions that came over and over again that people were wondering about. Now, for this series, we're not going to answer every question. We can't do that. But what we're going to do is we're going to study the Bible and say what decision-making principles are found in the Bible that we can then take and apply to questions like this. So I want you to think of a big decision or any decision that is facing you in this coming new year. Whatever it is, whether it's one of these on the screen or something else, we're going to, every Sunday of this series, study one principle, decision-making principle, that gives us insight into how to face those big decisions. Well, the first ones come from the book of Proverbs. We'll study 2 Proverbs that will share with us the decision-making principle for this first Sunday. The first proverb is a favorite of our middle school students at church. It says this: as a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool repeats his foolishness. This is the word of the Lord. Just kidding. But that's the first one. That's the first proverb. And in a very similar theme comes the next one, Proverbs 17:10. A single rebuke does more for a person of understanding than 100 lashes on the back of a fool. Well, what do these proverbs have in common? I would argue that a common theme emerges from both of these proverbs, and that theme will be our principle of decision-making today that comes from the Bible. We'll get it on the screen for you. Your past experiences should illuminate your future choices. Well, think about the first proverb. The first proverb talks about the difference between a foolish person and a wise person. And they say the foolish person makes those same mistakes over and over and over again without really learning from them. And the author says that's kind of like a dog that throws up, walks away, and then comes back to sniff the vomit as if it's not theirs. And everybody goes, oh, that's so gross. Why do dogs do that? And that's the type of reaction that the author wants us to feel when we're repeating and returning to those same patterns, those same mistakes over and over and over again. We should have that same reaction of, why am I doing this? What is this all about? Or in a similar way, the second proverb teaches that a wise person will learn the first time from making a mistake. Now, we all make mistakes, right? But we can't go through life not making them, but the wise person learns quickly from a single rebuke, while a foolish person could do the same thing 100 times and still return for that 101st time. And so these proverbs really are reminiscent of a famous saying, one you've probably heard before, where those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it. It's essentially what these proverbs are saying, that if you don't remember your past, if you don't study what your personal history is and learn from it, then you'll be right back there before too long. And so when you have big decisions to make, your past experiences can illuminate your future decisions. Really, what we see from these proverbs is that your past is there to teach you, if you're willing to learn from it. And in order to learn from your past, you need to ask questions about your past, particularly those times where you're making the same mistakes over and over and over, or if you find a pattern of behavior that's not working in your life. You need to be able to look back at your life and say, what are those experiences that I keep returning to that do not work? For example, you might say, wow, I keep struggling in relationships. I keep hitting the same thing in relationships that doesn't seem to work. What the Proverbs would encourage you to ask is to say, well, what could you do differently? If it's the same mistake and the same thing that's being repeated so often, well, what's the common denominator? And so as you study that and say, well, am I dating the same type of person over and over? Are our personalities just clashing and it's never really going to work? Or if you're thinking about, do I do this sort of job or career, or should I make a career change? And you say, well, what can I learn from my past? Have I had jobs like that before? And how did they go? Were they fulfilling for me? Did I do a good job with them? Or did I get kind of burned out and not really like what I was doing? You're able to look at your past, examine your past experiences to say, what does my future hold? And how should this influence the decisions I'm making today? It's a really general principle, isn't it, that these Proverbs describe? I mean, there's nothing earth-shattering about this concept to learn from your past and to learn from your history. What's interesting to me, though, is that we all know that and probably agree with it, but still end up in the same patterns of behavior, making the same mistakes, and falling into those same cycles. And so I wonder, is even though we all recognize the general principle, if we need to dig a little bit deeper into our lives and into our past to really learn from it and our mistakes. And so I'm going to offer 3 areas this morning that we can study from our past to learn from for future decisions. I believe we can study and learn from your personal history, your family history, and your spiritual family's history. Well, let's start with the first one, your own personal history, which is the easiest because it's your history. It's the most accessible to you. It's the experiences you've had. So I would encourage you to think of the ones that haven't worked, or the experiences that led you to a place that you got there and said, that's not where I wanted to end up. So if we're studying your past and your personal experiences, we have to ask why. Why do I keep ending up there? And the red flag or the caution that I would throw up for you is that we often do this because we end up looking at our past through rose-colored glasses. We look at our past and say, yeah, that didn't work, but I bet it will this time. I'll try again. I'll do better. This will work out this time. I thought of particularly students, at least when I was a student, and I would be getting the same grade on an exam or test. And I'd be thinking, why? Why am I getting these same grades over and over and over? And then I'd think, well, none of my study habits have changed. I'm studying the same way, so why am I expecting different results? We study our own personal history and say, what are the repeating behaviors? And what are the things that I need to change? I would guess that a good tip for those is to learn not to lie to yourself. To learn not to look at your history and say, oh, it'll work out this time. But instead to really look realistically. And maybe that involves having coffee with a friend and saying, you know me well. Am I thinking about this correctly? Or am I going to fall into the same pattern? Good friends are good for that. Family members are good for that. But if studying objectively, your own personal history. That's where we start if you're making a future decision. You start with your own experiences. But you don't end there. Then we go on to your family history. And that means two things. For one, your parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles have probably experienced things that you have not experienced before. And so go talk to them. Go ask them. Say, how was this for you? What did you learn from that? If you're one of those students who are thinking about a major or thinking about a concentration to study, who do you know that has done those sort of majors or concentrations before? And go talk to them. Say, how did this work for you? I want to learn from your experience. We recognize you're not the exact same person, but you can still learn something from them. So that's part of it. Go talk to those people who have walked that path before. But then it is also an opportunity to understand how your family background might be affecting your current thinking. For example, if you grew up in a family of yellers and you thought, I'm not going to be a yeller, but then when you get upset, you find that your voice starts rising, it's good to learn from that, to say, how does my family affect me and the decisions that I make today? Or perhaps you might think, well, my parents worked all the time, and I didn't get the family time that I want. And now you're in a high-powered career and thinking, well, I want to climb that ladder. It might teach you to say, well, I need to pause for a second if I don't want to end up like my family has ended up. It's an opportunity not to blame your family or the mistakes that you perceive they made, but to learn what you want your future and your future decisions to make. And so you learn from your personal history, but you learn from your family's history as well. But then the third way to look at your past and learn from it is to learn from your spiritual family's history. And what that means is opening up the Bible and reading the experiences of people in the Bible and the things that went well and the things that didn't go well. So even if you yourself have not experienced those things, you can still learn from people who have gone through those experiences. I'll give you an example. It comes from the book of Jude. Jude is writing to an early church, and here's what he says to this early church. In verse 3, he says, "Dear friends, I have been eagerly planning to write to you about the salvation we all share. But now I find that I must write about something else, urging you to defend the faith that God has entrusted once for all time to his holy people." I wonder if you're sensing a sense of urgency in this letter. Jude is writing, and he's saying to the early church, listen, I was going to write about the salvation that we all share. That was going to be the topic that I was going to write about, which we would all probably think that's a good topic. I'd love to learn more about this salvation that we hold. But Jude is changing course. He says, I'm not going to talk about that anymore. No, instead, now I'm going to talk about how to defend the faith. And we might be saying, well, why? Why are you changing course from talking about salvation to talking about defending the faith? And Jude goes on in verse 4 to say why. Verse 4 says, I say this because some ungodly people have wormed their way into your churches, saying that God's marvelous grace allows us to live immoral lives. The condemnation of such people was recorded long ago, for they have denied our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ. All right, so the picture is getting a little bit clearer now, isn't it? Jude's saying, I can't talk about the topic I wanted to talk about, salvation, because there's some people who have infiltrated the church and are now spreading these new ideas about God that he believes are incorrect. The view particularly that God's grace is so good that not only does it cover all sins, but then you can just keep on sinning because God's grace covers that. Jude's going, oh, that's an incorrect view of God, and I want to go and teach against that. And so Jude goes on to tell his early church that they have a big decision to make. Their decision is, do they trust Jude's teaching, the teaching he believes is correct, or do they trust these new teachers that are now in the church and have a new idea of grace that Jude would not agree with? This is their big decision. And to get to an understanding of what decision they should make, Jude reminds them of their spiritual history. Check it out in verse 11. He says this, what sorrow awaits them, talking about the false teachers. For they follow in the footsteps of Cain, who killed his brother. And like Balaam, they deceive people for money. And like Korah, they perish in their rebellion. He gives 3 examples of people from the Old Testament: Cain, Balaam, and Korah. And he says, church, early church, remember these people and the mistakes that they made, and let's not repeat those mistakes. He says, remember Cain. Cain in the book of Genesis was brothers with Abel, and Abel had a better relationship with God, and Cain became jealous and killed Abel. And the analogy he's drawing is that these early church leaders who are spreading kind of false teaching are spreading it because of the same sense of jealousy. So he's saying, don't be like Cain. And then he goes, remember Balaam. Balaam, it's a great story with the talking donkey, if you don't remember that one in the book of Numbers. But Balaam tries to sell God's blessing for financial gain. And so he's telling the early church, don't be like Balaam, because that's what these teachers are doing. They're trying to be out for themselves, and they're trying to get God's blessing through their own financial gain. And he says, and remember Korah. Don't be like Korah. Korah despised Moses' leadership and tried to get a rebellion, an uprising against him that God then squashed down. And so he's saying, don't be like Korah, because that's what these teachers are trying to do. They're trying to get a rebellion against good, authentic teaching. You see what Jude's doing? He's encouraging this early church to remember the people who went before them, the mistakes that they made, and saying, don't repeat those same mistakes. It's fascinating, because they're experiences that we didn't have, right? We didn't live back then. But Jude's point is that it's your spiritual heritage. It's your spiritual family. And so you can still learn from them and the things that they made, the mistakes that they made, so that you don't have to repeat them. And so I hope, as we look to this new year, you have a variety of decisions in front of you. Some will be big decisions, some will be small decisions, and some will be really important decisions. My hope is that you can study your past, your personal history, that you can study your family's history, and especially your spiritual family's history, to learn the mistakes and the patterns that you fall into, move away from those, so that you can move confidently into the future with God by your side in this new year. That's why we begin the first Sunday of the new year right here at the table, because we remember that the most important decision that we will ever make is the decision to follow God with all that we are, the decision to pick up our cross daily and follow him.